My name is Justin Biddle. I'm a faculty member at the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech, and this semester I have the pleasure of being a fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Britt Holbrook, a colleague of mine at Georgia Tech in the School of Public Policy. Britt did his PhD across town in Atlanta at Emory University. He described it to me last night as a Nietzschean response to Alasdair MacIntyre's virtue ethics. Alasdair MacIntyre, those of you who know, is a distinguished philosopher here at Notre Dame. He's done work in a number of areas, but particularly for this conference is his work on the incorporation of ethics into emerging technologies. And he will speak to us this morning about institutionalizing reflection. Can we design a mechanism to harness ethics expertise? Britt.
Thanks, Justin. So just to follow up on one comment I made in the last session, there's the space, the website, if you want to find the tech debate, and you can actually see recordings of these Ron Arkin and Rob Sparrow's talks. I actually also had an idea similar to Elizabeth's. And one of the things I wanted to do actually was to use this session to springboard more discussion. I don't like to hear myself talk. I certainly don't want to hear myself talk to the void for an hour and a half. So what I want to do is try to spark some discussion. I won't read a paper. I won't give you a formal power presentation. What I want to do is throw out some ideas. I want to pull up the actual report, look at the recommendations that have been made, and try to come up with some action. I was inspired by the first talk, which said let's be action-oriented. When I was invited to give this talk, I was directed to look at the action-oriented chapters of the report. Great. So let's actually look at those and try to do something that is action-oriented. I'm also motivated by this idea that our primary aim here is to help government agencies and other institutions, including universities. So if you actually look at the report, there's 5 recommendations, 4 of which are directed at government agencies, and the other of which is directed at research institutions like universities. Think through how to sort of approach these issues. So that's what I'm going to do. Because it's informal, because there's like 8 people in the room here, what I propose, if I say something and you want to interject immediately, Justin's got a mic, he'll run up to you, and we can really start having a conversation early. I've got notes. It's not completely disorganized, but it's not a presentation. You're not going to mess me up. So much for that. Let me first say something. I know now I've walked away from the mic. Can everyone hear me still? Because I'm hooked up to the recording, so I'm okay. So even if I talk out here, it's still being recorded. So I actually want to say a little bit more about my expertise. I thought it was interesting that I got invited to participate in this conference because I'm not an expert in ethics of new and emerging technologies. What I've done my research on is science and technology funding agencies first and foremost, and especially the introduction and use of what you might call non-scientific criteria as part of the peer review process for grants. So it started off that I looked at the National Science Foundation's broader impacts merit review criterion. And this caused all sorts of uproar and difficulties for NSF, and then they spent a long time trying to sort of negotiate these things. And so I looked at how they were doing it and what scientists and engineers were saying about it, how this impacted the process of peer review, which later we'll talk about in terms of the notion of a mechanism. And so that's really, I think, where my research and my expertise has most bearing on what's going on here. This idea of coming up with institutional mechanisms to address issues that go beyond the area of, say, the scientific merit of the proposal. That has led me to look at other sorts of areas, including places where, and methods that people use, different ways of incorporating issues that would be identifiable as ELSI issues in scientific and technical research and not just in peer review processes. So that's my expertise. But now I want to talk about expertise more generally, because I actually think that there's something special about ethics and the idea of ethics expertise. And I actually want to say and defend the proposition that although there is some sense in which you can be an expert in ethics, you can get a PhD in philosophy, you can write your dissertation on ethical issues, you can be, you know, a Kantian or something like that. There's also a sense in which it doesn't make sense to talk about expertise in ethics. And this is why actually what Herb said about coming to a more sophisticated confusion actually rang true to me. And let me give you an example from the history of philosophy that backs this up, and that's Socrates. So one of the things that Socrates did, and of course, for those of you who are philosophers, you know, but for those of you who are not, you might not know Socrates is the hero for all philosophers. He's like the model. We all want to be Socrates. And you know, it's kind of weird because Socrates never wrote anything. He just went around talking to people. And really what he did was he went around and interrogated experts. People who felt like they had a kind of knowledge about practical matters. You know, oh, I'm going to go prosecute my father in a court of law for impiety. Somebody, Euthyphro, says to Socrates, and Socrates says, oh, wow, that's awesome. So you know all about piety. Can we talk? You're the expert. I really want to know about piety. And so there's this interrogation of expertise that goes on with Socrates. And the result of this usually is that the people who are self-professed experts are reduced to a situation of confusion, or the technical term for what I think the feeling that you mentioned is aporia. There's actually a philosophical technical term. There's a method that can get people to aporia, and that's the Socratic elenchus. So this is something that Socrates did. It's something that I think lies at the root of all philosophy, and especially ethical inquiry, is actually trying to get people to that point where they don't know. And not just don't know, but they're confused. So there's ignorance of ethical issues, then there's this period of questioning that then leads to confusion, and then hopefully what happens is once you break people down is you build them back up to the level of being able to be more sophisticated in their response, to be able to give an account, a defensible account of the ethics of what's going on, which doesn't necessarily mean having the answer that all the experts would agree on. That's something that I think comes out in the report. I forget exactly the phraseology you used. You said something like, this is Herb I'm talking to, something like not vagueness, but it was something like vagueness is a feature, not a flaw in the report. I can't.
Not vagueness, the lack of specificity.
Lack of specificity, right, okay, right. Lack of specificity, which one might think of in terms of vagueness. But you know.
I prefer my formulation.
Okay, well, you know, formulations are important, but it's a feature, meaning it's a virtue, is the way I would put it, of the report. It's not a flaw, it's a virtue, okay? I want to come back to that issue because that's actually something that I argued in reference to the National Science Foundation. Okay, so I'm working with a weird notion of expertise. It's not the sort of notion where if I'm an expert, I have knowledge, and then I can communicate that knowledge to you, and it goes in your head, and now you know what I know, and you could be considered an expert as well. Something more complicated than that. So now I want to look at this issue of a mechanism. Because if we're talking about expertise, which is something like knowledge transfer, it might make sense to talk about a mechanism. That is a kind of procedure that's predictable, a kind of method that we would follow, you know, where my knowledge could reliably and predictably move from my head to your head. That's what a mechanism brings to mind for me. So when I was reading the report, it struck me as incredible that there's a phrase in there, and I might get it wrong, but Herb can correct me, that judgment is perhaps the most important mechanism when it comes to looking at these issues that are raised in the report. And my immediate response was, what, are you kidding me? Judgment's not a mechanism. In fact, ethical thinking is not the sort of thing that you can put into a mechanism. You can't have a mechanism for ethical thinking. And so I actually had my hackles raised at the beginning of the report. And I thought, oh God, these guys are they're going to come up with theories, and then they're going to come up with a method, and then we're going to apply it, and then all the answers will be there. And I was pleasantly surprised at the lack of specificity in the report. Now, I do want to say, though, that this term mechanism, which has been applied to this issue of judgment, gets used a lot in science and technology funding agencies. So I looked first at NSF, but gradually I ended up looking at lots of other funding agencies, and this idea of a mechanism is sort of ubiquitous. At NSF, it might be used, say, in terms of what they would call a funding mechanism. So you can either put in a proposal to their normal mechanism for grants, or you could go to what they call an eager mechanism, which gives you a different kind of procedure to go through to get a different sort of grant. They have various mechanisms. So there's some connection between the idea of a mechanism and the institution itself. So institutions have within them mechanisms, but also I think if you go to a broader scale, you can say that institutions are themselves mechanisms within the larger society. So the National Science Foundation would be a funding mechanism within society. The other issue that I want to just sort of bring up is this question of design. So when you're dealing with mechanisms, it makes sense to talk about design. When you're dealing with institutions and social institutions, then I think it makes sense to think in terms of something like social engineering, which is kind of an iffy concept, but I think it's not so bad if you think of engineering less in terms of mathematics and more in terms of design. And the issue of design actually, I think, is one that we could take advantage of. There's some precedent for this kind of notion of stretching what we mean by a mechanism. So back in 1997, Ron Kostoff, who worked at the Office of Naval Research, published an article, or may have been an opinion, in Science magazine about GIPRA. And GIPRA is the Government Performance and Results Act. It was passed in 1993. And basically, it required that all federal agencies have some kind of a plan to respond to the idea that they're going to give results. They're going to have a strategic plan, they're going to have annual performance plans, and they're going to have metrics to show that the funding that Congress gives them produces results. And Kostoff was very concerned about how would this happen in the case of a basic funding agency like NSF. And what he argued was that the appropriate metric for this demonstration of results was peer review, which is interesting because peer review is not normally considered a metric. People might actually contrast peer review with metrics, where metrics are quantified and peer review involves judgment. So I actually think, though, there were good political reasons for describing peer review as a metric. And in this case, I think there might be good political reasons for describing judgment in terms of a mechanism. Another thing about approaching mechanisms from a design issue is, I think people have mentioned the categorical imperative here. I think that if we think in terms of design, we can think in terms of hypothetical imperatives. What that means is you basically have a goal, and if you want to reach that goal, then you do something else. Okay? And you only do that if you want to reach the goal. Well, okay, so let's think about what goals we want to achieve. Well, one goal we want to achieve, I think, that's sort of underlying the whole report is to find a way to instill a capacity for judgment at various levels throughout the research process. So there's talk about program officers needing judgment. People who run the agencies need judgment. People who do the research need judgment. People who use advanced technologies in the field, soldiers, need judgment. All of us need judgment. So what we really want is a mechanism to produce the mechanism of judgment. That's a design question. Can we do that? I already talked about this a little bit. So I looked up institution on Wikipedia, and it says an institution is a mechanism of social order. So these terms are sort of, interchangeable. Yeah, I talked about that already. Talked about that too. Okay. One thing that you said in your first talk, of the conference, was you made a distinction between decision makers and something like staff people. So like people who are doing things but may not be decision makers at a higher level. And what occurred to me at the time, and I think it was a point that got brought up later, was, well, people are making decisions at all kinds of levels. And so this idea of judgment being something that we want to instill in decision makers, I think we should actually think of ways to do it at multiple levels and treat everyone as a decision maker. Maybe their decisions aren't quite as important, but they do make decisions.
I can explain the context of that when we get to questions.
Well, you can do it now if you want.
Not so, yeah. I agree with you. Everyone in an organization has some level of decision making. What I was the idea I was trying to get across was that we did not, in envisioning this thing, that we did not want it to become a process like a checklist. So a staffer would sort of oversee the completion of a process. We were looking more for decision making. That was really what I meant by that.
Okay, so that's good. In fact, I like that contrast between decision making in the form of judgment and following a checklist. So I would even and have before characterized judgment as rule-seeking behavior, and whereas following a checklist would be rule following. And so what you want to be able to do is empower people to be able to seek out the rules and give them to themselves, as to kind of give them this kind of autonomy that they wouldn't have if they're merely following the rules or following a checklist. Great. Sounds like a great idea to me. But the question is, how do we institutionalize mechanisms for that, right? Let's say that's the kind of expertise that we want people to have. Expertise in judgment, that is ethical expertise. How do we make that happen? Okay, so that's an interesting question. I think that you say this in the report, which I think I'm going to call up now, because there are some things I want to talk about that are associated with the actual recommendations in the report. So for those of you who haven't read it, you should. The report's awesome. Here on, well, these pages don't match up with the pages in the report, but on page 24 of the PDF is sort of a summary of the findings and recommendations. And I'm going to use this because it's just shorter than going later on where these things are discussed more, I think, in chapter 7. All right, so all of these things in bold are findings of the report. I think, this issue of being different in a military context. I want to talk about that a bit and just throw out some ideas of ways in which the military has done things that are a little outside the box that I want to bring up as things maybe we could learn from, rather than just thinking in terms of ELSI in a civilian context and then thinking about ways of transferring that to a military context. Let's also look at things the military has done that are a little odd and see what they've been able to do and the problems that they've run into there, and see if we could maybe perhaps design things together with, rather than just, going from the civilian context to the military. Yeah, I want to get to the recommendations. All right. So the senior leaders need to be engaged with ethical issues. In some cases, that's easy because you've already got some kind of evidence of engagement, and you say, well, and they should make a public declaration that ethics are important. Okay, so DARPA actually requested the report, the study, right? So you've got some public evidence there. There's some engagement. They're interested. Okay, but now you need to get them to the point of having this kind of ethical expertise, which constitutes judgment. Is there a mechanism for that? How are you going to instill judgment in somebody if it's not just a matter of taking the information from my head and putting it in your head? Yeah, good question, right? There's no mechanism for it. Well,
In practice, the answer to that is to hire the right people.
you mean to hire the right people to be directors of the agencies?
Yes, you presumably you hire people that you believe have good judgment, and however you make a test for that, that's what you do.
So the answer is to hire people who have good judgment. But you've already got people hired. You don't want to fire somebody who's already there, right? I mean, you've got people there. So one of the things that you might do is find some way to get them to have the kind of judgment that you're looking for. I think there is a mechanism for that. I think the mechanism for that is your report.
Well, so I think maybe we're being a little simplistic in focusing on the mechanism. How do you, what's the mechanism for giving them judgment? I think one of the underlying ideas that we had was using the discussion to create the sensitivity that then makes them think about these issues. That's the idea.
But that's right, and that's why the report is the mechanism. And I'm purposely stretching the term mechanism.
So I have to hold some of my comments in reserve, or else I'm not going to have anything to say at 3 o'clock, since my talk is basically on exactly the same questions, like precisely the same questions that you've raised. So I appreciate this. But let me just say a couple of things. So actually in psychology, moral psychology in particular, there is in the literature this increasing tendency to make a distinction between ethics expertise as something that's knowledge and theory-based, and what some people would call genuine moral expertise, which is what I'm going to call sort of practical wisdom in the sense of virtue ethics, which is character-based and practice-based. So I would say judgment then is not a mechanism, it's a virtue, right? It's a virtue of persons, not organizations. But on the other hand, you have to figure out, as you're pointing out, how you're going to get that virtue into the organizational setting. And the organization itself is going to have, I wouldn't say a mechanism, but it's going to have structures that can cultivate and encourage the development of that. But I want to agree partly with Herb that it has to be, at least to some extent, about hiring the right people, because judgment isn't something that can be taught in that knowledge transfer sense, right? So the report itself, for example, can't produce good judgment or transfer good judgment to somebody who's not already in some manner fit to receive that sensitivity, or has some already of the virtues of good judgment. But what it can do, because judgment, especially in psychology, we're finding judgment is not a sort of universal skill that is demonstrated equally across all situations. So judgment is often context specific. And so I can be a really good judge about certain kinds of things and not so great a judge about other sorts of things. which is contrary to what Aristotle thought, but the evidence seems to suggest that at least in some ways, while there are these broader virtues, the specific knowledge and experience in a particular domain, right, is what produces the kind of judgment that you want. So I think I would just agree partially with you that yes, the report is going to be one mechanism for perhaps stimulating at least that kind of experience and that kind of reflection. But there's going to have to be another piece to that, and then you're going to have further questions about how the organization can foster those parts that won't be just contained in that report.
Yeah, we're not disagreeing, actually. So it's
Yeah, I
not
don't
that
think so.
if you just read the report and learn to speak the language that's contained in the report, you automatically have judgment. So I think this notion that there are technical languages that are associated with particular areas of ethics is something that's mentioned in the report, and there is this idea that people who are program officers and work at funding agencies need to have some familiarity with this language. And you might even say something like they need to be able to talk that talk. But that doesn't by itself guarantee that they are going to have judgment. And yes, judgment goes beyond a mechanism. We're not actually disagreeing.
No, I don't think we are, so it was just a sort of minor point.
Okay, so, yeah, sorry. I mean, we've got plenty of time, I think, so we're good.
Here we are in a law school, and I'm a former law school dean, and since if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, I'll say that law is taught through, of course, the Socratic method. Why do we do that? And why are we putting these days such an emphasis on experiential learning? It is, I would posit, to create at the earliest possible moment judgment in our students. And I think then that simply reading the report is a step, but the follow-on activities, and perhaps this is something that Bob will want to talk about at our 2 o'clock session, is what kinds of activity-based learning could this report create? Because I think it's in the experiential learning process, maybe that's a mechanism in your language, that you will stimulate the creation of the kind of judgments you're looking for.
Yeah, I actually think that sort of case-based approach to education, and in the context of law, I think that makes a lot of sense. And in fact, you find people in ethics education and doing education and responsible conduct of research often using a case-based approach, and I think the reason they do it is precisely to cultivate this kind of judgment. It's not merely about learning a theory and then applying it. So I agree with that. I like it. I also think in terms of action items, you mentioned yesterday that you were thinking of teaching the report in one of your classes. I mentioned that at lunch before you made that remark. And I think that that's a natural place that people might make use of the report. In any sort of ethics education class, especially that has to do with science and technology, this report could be incredibly valuable and useful. And it's a free textbook, so the kids will like it. Okay. Oh, so I want to talk about other places that you might do things. So yesterday we had 2 users as part of the panel. One's still here, Patrick. Ruth is not here, I don't see her. But both, I think, had this a certain agreement on the idea that you don't want to do this on the grant by grant level, but I think this conflicts with one of the recommendations at least. Okay. Well, that's annoying. See if that. All right. Maybe it won't let me go down below that part. So, well, I guess that's it. All right. So let me talk about this. So there are different levels. So it's the sort of people who are the heads of agencies need to have this sort of ability and interest in addressing ethical issues. Then there's people at the program level. So program officers need to have this. And this was tied to a temporal aspect so that there was a pre-screening, right? So when the program officers are thinking in terms of even developing programs, is this the type of area or vector was Ruth's language that we might have ethical, legal, or societal implications that we need to consider. Okay, so there's that. But then there's also on the individual grant level is included in the recommendations somewhere, right? And yesterday there was agreement, well, we don't want to do it on that level. And I think there are actually good reasons not to want to do it on that level because it becomes incredibly complicated and because what you need to do then is instill in the individual reviewers a capacity for judgment. And then the question again becomes, well, what's the mechanism for that? Well, this to me actually gets at the research that I've been doing on the relation between intellectual merit and broader impacts. It's like so NSF uses these two criteria, intellectual merit is a good science and broader impacts, what impact does it have on society? And what they experienced was everybody thought that intellectual merit criterion was clear and everybody thought that the broader impacts criterion was unclear. They didn't know what that meant. And if you just look at the language, they're actually both equally clear. There's no problem with it. It's what they had was a kind of facility. They knew their way about in terms of intellectual merit because they had disciplinary standards. Whereas they didn't know, they weren't experts in broader societal impacts, and that was the problem. So what you can do is, say, do something like you might do with the peer review of interdisciplinary proposals. If you've got an interdisciplinary proposal that includes, say, philosophy and engineering, you don't just have the engineers review it because you need some relevant expertise in philosophy. So you put it together a multidisciplinary review panel. That's one possible mechanism. So you include some LC experts on the review panel. Doesn't necessarily solve all your problems, but peer review is a messy business. It always is. So that's one option for doing it at the level of the individual proposal. It's also the case that in terms of impact and doing peer review, including impact criteria, what I found in the course of my research is different agencies do it differently. The way that the impact criteria are written will affect how they get reviewed, who you pick as the reviewer, having the right people, those make differences, who the program officer is, how the program officer engages with the different criteria makes a difference. Different agencies do it differently. Some agencies actually do include, say, members of the general public. There's one funding agency called the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, which is part of DOD, and they actually include users or consumers, I think they call them, as part of the review process. So there's a plethora of examples for how one might go about doing this. There's also the recommendation that LC concerns get integrated at the level of the actual research, so temporally as the research is taking place. So one possible mechanism for doing this is the STIR project. This is out of Arizona State. It's affiliated with the Center for Nanotechnology and Society. The person who initially developed the STIR protocol is Eric Fisher. And I actually think that this is an incredibly potentially useful approach to integrating ethics and LC concerns as research is actually taking place. So there's a couple of aspects about it. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but there's a couple of aspects to it that I think make it a potentially very attractive option. First, there's empirical evidence to back up the fact that the protocol actually does make a difference. It has been used in labs, so it's been laboratories, and there's a little video there that if I were to press play, you'd see, and he has the humanist walk into the lab and all the scientists drop their stuff and go, ee, and they flee away, right? But he actually has experience having done this himself and has taught the protocol to various other people. They've gone in the labs, they've written up reports, and basically you can show that if you follow the STIR protocol or something very much like it, then what happens is people start to realize, first of all, he had told me about one experience. One person said, I'm not a decision maker. I don't make decisions. And you know, gradually over the course of the actual engagement where the humanist was embedded in the lab, what this person came to realize was, oh yeah, I do make decisions. And not only do I make decisions, but I can make different decisions. And I could think about my decisions, and I could think about things that I didn't think about before. And so now all of a sudden, what are you doing? You're finding a way to instill judgment. Now here's what's really interesting about it to me. The way that the protocol works is you essentially just ask questions. Like this. Not like, hey, what are the ethical implications of that? No. It's like, why did you use that compound? Or why did you wash your hands before you did that? Why did you order this material in bulk? Why did you order from this place? I mean, you just start asking people about the decisions that they're making, and what happens is gradually they start thinking more broadly about them. Things that were just habitual or they were just following rules, they start to question and reflect on, and this by itself becomes a way of instilling actual Elsie-type reflective ability, or at least a propensity to move in that direction, which I think is a fascinating finding of STIR. So there's that. Okay, that's a civilian thing that, you know, might be used in, I think, a military context, because of course you could put somebody, the embedded humanist, and we'll just use that term because Eric has used it, the embedded humanist in a lab that's doing military research. There's no reason you can't do that, just like you can put in a lab doing non-military research. But there's a couple of other examples where the military has tried to do things like embed humanists, except in the case of one of the things I want to talk about briefly, the human terrain system, it was anthropologists that they embedded, right? And so what happened was there was this idea that, oh, okay, so when we go over and invade these countries, we're going to have a problem, and what we need to do is win hearts and minds. Makes sense. So what do we need to do? We need to understand the other culture. Okay, so who's an expert in culture? Well, anthropologists. So we'll just bring the anthropologist who's the expert in culture along, embed the anthropologist with the military unit, and have that person exercise their expertise about culture, and we'll win hearts and minds. That's the mechanism, right? Well, of course, it doesn't quite work that way. And in fact, what happened was you got pushback from a different institution. The American Anthropological Association actually came out with a statement against anthropologists being involved with the human terrain system. And this had to do with things like, well, misuses of anthropology in the past for things like racist policies and all kinds of like really bad things that anthropologists don't want you to know. Okay, but here you've run up against different sets of values, different institutions, and you've created a huge disincentive for the anthropologists to be engaged with the human terrain systems program. Okay, that's a design issue. If we wanted to do something like that, say for Elsie experts, and actually consider the possibility of putting an Elsie expert embedded in the field with an Army unit or with the Air Force or wherever, with a military unit that's actually using these technologies, we'd have to consider the mechanism for doing that. Okay. Something like a human terrain system, I think, is a good example of things not to do, probably. I haven't done extensive research on it. They've obviously made some mistakes. Okay, so is there a way of sort of, including civilians in the military? Well, one thing that occurred to me was the National Guard. So then I sort of Googled, well, okay, National Guard, are they doing anything to, that goes beyond just like, teaching somebody who's a civilian also to, fly a plane? Well, yeah, there's this thing called the Agriculture development teams, agricultural development teams. And these are National Guard units that now are being deployed in, I think, Afghanistan. And what they're doing is actually helping the Afghani population develop agricultural studies, actually grow things, you know, and trying to help people. And this, I think, as far as I can tell, briefly looking at it, is more successful than the human terrain system. Okay, could you find a way to, say, maybe have a National Guard unit that is LC oriented? That sounds a little weird, but I mean, why not think along those lines? So you actually have people who are members of the military who also are trained in LC. One of the things that the agricultural development teams do is they train other people, and they do this approach that they call train the trainers. And anybody who knows anything about RCR training, responsible conduct of research training, knows that the idea of training the trainers is something that is very much practiced in responsible conduct of research. So there seems to be a lot of overlap there and potential for getting things together. One other thing. So the last recommendation was about institutions of research and learning, like universities. The idea is that universities need to be able to support their own researchers in their LC-type reflections. And there's this idea that we want to have a small footprint, right? We don't want to make this a huge administrative burden for universities. So in the report, there's sort of a lot of talk about, well, there are existing mechanisms like institutional review boards and stuff like that. And maybe we could have a way of, you know, sort of sticking the LC aspect onto existing mechanisms. I don't like that idea. And here's the reason I don't like that idea. I think it instills a compliance mentality, and that's counterproductive when what you're trying to do is get people engaged in ethical reflection. If you're trying to get them to develop some kind of skill that we call judgment, a sensitivity to ethical issues, a facility with a language, and an ability to make decisions that are informed by some kind of systematic reflection, then the last thing you want to do is require them to do that. But that's counterintuitive, perhaps. But you don't want to require it. Why? Because academics don't like to be required to do anything. Because our notion of academic freedom is, leave us alone. It's true. I mean, that's what we feel like. So, you know, I teach a class at Tech called Science, Technology, and Human Values. And it's a room about 4 times the size of this one. I get 188 engineers in it. It's all engineers. The first question I ask them is, why are you here? And I make them write why they're here. And the answer that all of them write is because it's required. So what's their attitude coming in? Well, it's a bad one, right? This isn't going to be a group that's ready to be instilled with ethical reflective ability. That's why I make them think about why they're there, right? I don't make them, I ask them to. They could resist. Okay, so universities. Here's the thing. Yesterday there was in the Synth Bio presentation this idea of duties that people have, and if you're doing synthetic biology, there were these concrete list of duties. And one of them was that if you're involved in synthetic biology research, it was something like you have a duty to identify the legal gaps and think about filling those gaps. Right? It was something like that. And I thought to myself, well, okay, so you're going to tell people they got a duty to do this. It's almost like telling them they have to do it. And if you do that, the problem is you haven't designed the mechanism correctly. You can't just tell them they got a duty. You got to think in terms of their reward system, so tenure and promotion. Universities, it's not just, oh, you need to like sort of beef up your IRB. No, you need to think about redesigning your tenure and promotion criteria to include things like being rewarded for LC engagement. Justin showed me just before we came down here, Georgia Tech has a generic CV form or something like that, and now they've included a section called societal impact on your official Georgia Tech CV. I'm like, there you go, because you're actually thinking about how to redesign things in a way that will encourage people to have societal impact. Now it's recognized on the CV. To talk about something that is a light footprint, you put it down there and you tell people, yeah, you get rewarded for this. Good. You start instilling among members of the research community a desire to do these things rather than telling them, oh, you got to do it. This is also, I think, one of the main problems with the whole idea of ELSI and say like what happened with the Human Genome Project. Oh, it was a great boon for researchers and ethicists. You know, there was all this money, the biggest funding program ever for ethics. Awesome, but it happened over here. And then all the genome research happened over here. And never the twain shall meet. You know, it was sort of a failure, I think, of institutional design. A bad mechanism. It was a get off our back mechanism. Maybe it was good for that, but it wasn't good for instilling judgment. So, again, now I've gone on too long. Can we sort of open back up and begin a conversation? And let me add one more thing. I like the session idea for 2 o'clock. I have to leave then because I'm catching a plane. So I want to start now where I can be included in that conversation. And then over lunch, if people want to sit down and talk about things over lunch, like I'd love to, you know, if you don't have other plans, talk about your presentation because I won't be here for it. So let's talk.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this last point that you raised. So I really kind of cringe when we're talking about ethics and academic freedom in the same sentence, because I think that a lot of academics tend to hide behind this veil of academic freedom as a means of sort of being in denial that they have to be considerate of the implications of their work. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we phrased the report the way we did, maybe in too far, you know, as far as you're going in terms of making it look like a compliance kind of thing. But if you don't force people to think about these things at academic institutions, my experience, I think of others in the committees, that they just will not.
So I actually think there's some wisdom there. And another area that I'm engaged with, and this is not my own doing quite, I've been reached out to by libraries. So a lot of them now are adopting open access policies. And what they are doing is actually mandating that people put their research in open access repositories. And this has caused a huge uproar among certain disciplines and certain areas of the faculty, and the appeal has been this interferes with our academic freedom. And so I actually think that we need to rethink what we mean by academic freedom. So I know that sounds like a gargantuan task. Oh, what are you going to do there? Well, that's my next book, right? Okay. So I'm serious. I'm actually working on a book on this idea. But I do think that that's what we need to do rather than sort of being content merely with, you know, well, let's interfere as little as possible, but make a mandate that's not really a mandate or something like that will instill a kind of compliance mentality. We could think better about how to design the institution and redesign it to encourage ethical reflection and engagement with ethical issues.
But until we can redesign that, we'll stop it.
Well, yeah, but I mean, why can't we begin the process of redesigning it now? Why? This gets back to the question of the perfect, saying, oh, well, you can't do ethical reflection because you can't predict the future. And your response in the report is, well, you can't do it perfectly, but that's not an excuse not to do it at all.
Start now, but I think let's face the reality that making changes at academic institutions is a glacial process.
Okay, yes, but that's partly because of bad attitudes and a conception of academic freedom that says, leave us alone, which you've already identified and agreed, I think, is part of the problem. So let's rethink it. Let's have a conversation about it. Somebody, commission the national academies to come up with a report on this, and then we'll have a mechanism.
Just following up on the same topic, one of the things that I appreciated in the report a lot was the brief remark about the importance of cultivating institutional memory and a sense of history with respect to ELSI issues. And I think I wasn't thinking about it in the academic context at the time, but I think it's relevant to this conversation that we're having. A lot of institutions have these sort of one-off projects that attempt to cultivate some sort of ethical sensitivity or some sort of value project. And no one ever goes back and looks at how well it worked. No one ever compares that method or that mechanism with one of the many other mechanisms in the past that have worked. And there's this sort of disconnected process of gesturing towards something and then never following up and saying, gee, how could we have done that better? How can we have a mechanism next time that will be more effective? And I think that's something that at the very highest levels of an institution, you can do something about, to sort of cultivate a long-term process of internal reflection on how the university's attempt, assuming it has a long-term commitment to ELSI concerns, how its efforts are going in that respect, and that's something that maybe.
I totally agree, and say you were the head of an ethics center at a big national or international Catholic university. It might be one of the things that you did was to say, we're going to actually be a repository for an institutional memory for Notre Dame. Oh, did I say Notre Dame? I mean, some university. It's the kind of thing you might do.
Here. First of all, just a brief comment. I'm less worried about this issue of mandating behavior one way or another. I mean, there's lots of examples of even academics being mandated to do X, Y, and Z, such as speaking to broader impacts in their grant proposals. And yes, there's a lot of pushback, but gradually it does begin to change the culture, and gradually we have more and more people saying, well, I do need to think about this, and so on. But the question I really wanted to come to is this. I hear in your talk a tension that I think also runs through the report between importing the ELSI expertise from the outside in the form of the embedded humanist, or I actually liked your National Guard unit example. That was very clever. Surprising, but very clever. There's a tension between this idea of importing your expertise from the outside and growing from within whatever is the suite of capacities that you need in decision makers at all levels. I myself am pretty much a cynic about the import the expertise from outside model. I think that brings with it a certain lack of sophistication about the technical issues, especially, that is essential for proper reflection on the ethical challenges arising out of the technical development. So I'm strongly drawn toward the idea of designing systems, mechanisms, if you want to call them that, for structuring institutions in ways to make more likely the emergence of these kinds of individuals. And if I might, could I just ask you to reflect in front of us a little bit more on what that might involve? It's got to be more than just hire the right people, right? I'd just like to invite you to say a little bit more about how you structure an institution to make more likely the emergence of this kind of engagement, sophistication, sensitivity.
Okay, so I mean, I think there are various ways of doing it, and I think it should be at multiple levels. one of the areas for me that is a place I really want to get into and haven't been able to yet for reasons of sort of, it's not a classification, but they just don't want to let me in, is I want to look at the training for NSF program officers. Because I know the program officers are like a big point at which this attitude towards the broader impacts criterion gets mediated. So I want to get in there and try to see what the training is that's involved with the merit review process for incoming program officers. Okay, so one thing that you might do is think about designing the training for program officers to include an LC component. That would be one way of doing it. Another thing that you might consider doing actually is either on the particular program level, say there's one program area or vector that you think really has LC issues associated with it, is adding an additional criterion that says, can you talk about as part of your proposal what the LC issues might be? Can you talk about whether you have an LC team that's going to be part of your research in this technical way and that's going to address these issues? So you actually make as a requirement of putting in a proposal that they address LC issues as part of the proposal, so pre and then during the research. Okay, then you might then have to have external experts as reviewers who are experts in LC. But it's things like that. So training of program officers, changing merit review criteria, putting out public statements about principles is something that I think can serve as a mechanism. And I purposely have been using mechanism in a very loose sense, in the sense in which we consider judgment a mechanism. I basically think it's not a mechanism, right? So none of these things are mechanisms in the sense that they're predictable. And
that last comment you made is quite relevant for our report. And what I don't know is how, and I see Steve is here at the moment, how DARPA's research works. Is it all contracted out to academic institutions? If so, what kind of program officer structure do they have?
Yeah, so DARPA is not one of the agencies I've looked at in the past. After this workshop, I might actually do it because it's actually really interesting to do research on funding agencies. It's not a big sort of industry within academic philosophy. You don't get recognized very well for doing that kind of research. But I think it's actually important for the world to do that kind of research. So I can't answer your question about how DARPA is structured. Maybe other people know.
Universities and companies, they don't have an in-house.
No in-house research group. They don't have labs. So they're more like NSF than they are like NIH.
So I probably know maybe a little bit more about this. DARPA doesn't have its own laboratory. They're a funding agency as we are at AFOSR. So they have program managers that send out money to various organizations, certainly academic institutions, industry, but also the government service laboratories, including the DOE laboratories, do execute a certain amount of the DARPA programs. And another interesting thing that maybe you'll find interesting is that DARPA doesn't execute all of its money internally either. It sends some of its money to the service funding organizations, and we act as their program managers in coordination with them.
And do you know whether DARPA or say your own organization, which is the Air Force Office of
Scientific Research,
OSR, right? Do you operate with a strong program officer model where you get to decide, basically, you do peer review, but you don't have to follow what the peer reviewers say?
That's correct.
Okay. So in a situation like that, so it differs, right, according to agencies, but in a situation like that, that raises the importance of how you train the program officers, right? It's less about what the criteria are that the reviewers consider, or even the expertise of the reviewers. So this is going to vary according to the actual institution you're dealing with. And I actually think that moving from philosophical reflection about these things to looking at people who, as social scientists, say, are looking at, say, institutional behaviors and looking at institutional structures, organizational change. I mean, there's all kinds of social scientific literature that probably would be able to contribute to this, the answer to this.
Over dinner last night, Patrick made a very specific suggestion on how one might train program officers. You might share that with. Oh, yeah. It was after the second glass of wine. Right? Yeah. You were talking about the school in Washington that, yeah.
Yeah, so the report made a suggestion that the Defense Acquisition University be approached to perhaps actually teach at least some of the things that are embedded in the report itself. And I thought that's a great opportunity or idea. I don't know who would actually approach them to do this, but I thought it was a good suggestion within the report.
I know very little about this, but we were talking at dinner last night with Steve, and Herb was there, and a couple other people about DARPA. And one interesting thing, and I knew about this because I had learned about it being at like DEF CON Black Hat, but Mudge is of the DEF CON group. He is like a total geek hacker, and he was chosen and agreed to, and I was saying to Steve last night, how did DARPA think of this? He was made a, director of research program. I'm an anthropologist. But what was astounding was I heard Mudge speak several times at like Black Hat and DEF CON when we're talking about institutional change taking place glacially. This is true, but this is also, there are times when there's remarkable creativity, and this was one of them where Mudge was talking about, listen guys, he was trying to explain to them why did I as a hacker go in to, lead this DARPA research, team. And he was saying, we have most of the answers here. We are the people making the foundations of the digital universe. And he said, I wanted to give us a chance to make this creativity move out into the world. And in his first year, he, as I was saying at dinner last night, he was saying that he put on his hacker hat and looked at the application process for DARPA funding and realized it was completely incomprehensible and that no creative geek could ever or would ever go through it. So he literally rewrote and DARPA accepted. And Steve was saying, yeah, he said, this is totally true. We encouraged this. I'm like, that is insanely cool given the circumstances. So then Mudge, I learned a lot about what they were doing because he was showing the teams he had pulled in from the DEF CON group and some of the incredible creative breakthroughs they had made because he set up completely different application processes.
Yeah, I mean, just changing things like that can make a huge difference. Also, different agencies are totally different, and there are different institutional cultures at different agencies. And my feeling, and maybe you can confirm or deny this, but my feeling is DARPA's reputation is of being agile, encouraging creativity, encouraging innovation, encouraging like crazy ideas, high risk, high reward kind of stuff. So what if DARPA, since actually they did, commission the report, what if DARPA took an approach that said, let's actually come up with a program that says, we want your craziest ideas for how to design an ELSI program that would integrate ELSI considerations, and maybe they could divide it temporally before, during, and after. And maybe DARPA then, we work with the National Guard, and we actually come up with these units and figure out how to train them, and then we see what happens when you deploy them in the field and stuff like that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I feel like.
It's a recursion problem.
What's that mean?
Recursive problem.
Say more.
Well, recursive. We want them to actually do something that they want to do.
So, but that's not a problem, that's an opportunity, right? And there are other opportunities. NSF funds research on ELSI topics all the time. So, there are opportunities for synergy. Oh yeah, action items. So the report is really awesome, okay? It's super awesome.
The next publication should have your recommendation on the cover, don't you think?
Well, what I was going to say is, the report is designed for policymakers, and I don't know about y'all, but I don't know any who are going to read 300 pages. So can you come up with a one-page version?
With a video?
Well, I mean, video might not be such a bad idea. But I mean, seriously, you got to come up with some bite-sized version, and you can point people to the whole thing, but they're not going to read 300 pages. As brilliant as the whole report is, I think it's great. It should be taught in a semester-long class, but no policymaker is going to sit through that. So that was one suggestion.
That's not, we heard that yesterday. Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks.